And one more starting.
Sure.
So many buttons.
I'm getting all the notifications here, so it looks like you're doing everything right.
Everyone's trickling in. Wonderful. Welcome. All right, that's going perfect. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Just going to give a couple more minutes for folks to trickle in here. Not even a few minutes. I just like watching all of those participant numbers trickle in. So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our virtual event tonight with Shelby Forsythia for her book, Your Grief, Your Way. I'm Jessica from the Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, and we are grateful to be here in this virtual space with our fellow Books in Common Northwest stores, Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Madison Books in Seattle, Washington. Visit booksincommonNW.com for more information, and be sure to follow us on Eventbrite to register for more great books or more great events about books. Before we get to our speaker this evening, we want to point out a few things about our virtual space. You can purchase a copy of Shelby's book by visiting booksincommonNW.com and clicking on the logo of your favorite sponsoring store. I'll drop a link into the chat here in just a few minutes. It's just hard to type and speak to you at the same time. So we are recording this event, and it will be viewable most likely a little later this evening. If you have to duck out to miss it, just check out the Books in Common NW YouTube channel, and you can find Shelby's event there along with all of the other events that we have been able to do in the last year or so. If you have a question for Shelby, you can submit them by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or drop them in the chat. I'll be watching for those to come through. If you run into any tech issues along the way, we do recommend that you first try exiting and re-entering the webinar. If you're unable to re-enter, do check out that YouTube stream. We are live there now, so if you can't get back in for some reason, you can always watch there. And then if you're having some sound issues, I do recommend grabbing some headphones. That can often fix any issues that you'll run into. And we do want to remind you that this is a shared creative space that we want to remain safe for everyone that has joined us this evening. So please be respectful. Offensive or inappropriate comments will see the user dismissed from this space. So without further ado, we are absolutely delighted to welcome Shelby Forsythia to the screen tonight to share her book, Your Grief, Your Way. Shelby is the author also of Permission to Grieve and the podcast host of Coming Back, Conversations on Life After Loss. After the unexpected death of her mother in 2013, she became a student of grief and set out on a lifetime mission to explore the often misunderstood human experience of loss. Through her books, weekly podcasts, and one-on-one grief guidance, she helps grieving people find direction, get support, and cultivate radical self-compassion after devastating loss. Her work has been featured in Huffington Post, Bustle, the Oprah magazine. You can visit her website at shelbyforsythia.com. Shelby, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm really excited to be here. Yes, my name is Shelby Forsythia. I'm an intuitive grief guide, and I wrote most recently this book, Your Grief, Your Way. I'm going to let it sit next to my face on the screen for a while because it often helps visually to know the book that you're looking for when you're out looking for a book at a store. And if for some reason you don't purchase it tonight, although you should, you can find it on your next trip to a local bookstore, or you might even be able to recognize it on a friend or family member's shelf. This little book is called Your Grief, Your Way, and it's called Your Grief, Your Way because so often the world tells us how to do grief. Society, our friends, our family, our coworkers, even our best friends will tell us what they think we should be doing with our grief. Even ourselves sometimes, we think we know how grief goes. When in reality, we lose somebody that we love, or we go through a divorce, or we get a diagnosis that changes our lives forever, or we make a sudden move geographically, or we lose a job, or we lose an extreme amount of money that we never thought we'd lose, or we experience pet loss or child loss or estrangement from a family member, and all of a sudden we do not know what grief is. And this is a little daily devotional, a non-religious daily devotional that takes you through 366 days of life after loss, ideally intentioned for people who have lost a loved one to death, but I've received several reviews on Amazon and on Goodreads as well that say no matter what your loss is, this will be applicable to you. Just change the the language out there a bit. I'll kind of open it up and show you how it's laid out. There's 2 entries on every page, so I'm in the middle of June right now. I'm going to let this take over the screen for a bit. At the top of each page, you'll see there's a quote from somebody in the world who has grieved. This could be somebody who published a grief book. This could be a celebrity. This could be another author. This could just be a person who said something wise about grief once. There's a little bit of commentary about the quote, why it's true, how you might see it show up in your own grief. And then the bottom entry is always something practical. It's always an exercise you can do, a place you can go, a website you can visit, a person you can write to, something that's applicable to you and your grief that you can do today. So, for example, I'll actually read these out loud since we're starting in June. June 27th says, "We do not have to become heroes overnight, just a step at a time, meeting each thing that comes up. Seeing is not as dreadful as it appeared. Discovering we have the strength to stare it down." And that's a quote from former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And the entry below it, or sort of my commentary on it, says, "Grief is big and scary because it is unknown, and it's really normal to back away from or avoid grief because of all of its unknownness. But consider this, grief is a part of you, so is it really entirely unknown? As you explore your grief, notice how much of what you're grieving leads back to you, your hopes, your dreams, your expectations, your fears, your anxieties, and beliefs. You might know grief better than you think you do. And that knowing, that wisdom, is a source of its own kind of strength." And then the paired entry below it from June 28th says, "If writing or concentrating on reading words is too hard for you in the aftermath of loss," a very, very, very normal grief response is to not be able to read, "consider recording your thoughts instead. Having your experience recorded not only helps you process what you're going through today, but over time you can see your progress and growth. After you've recorded for a while, go back and listen to your very first recording, your recording from 3 months ago, and your recording from last week. Having proof of your progress is another way to build up your strength and confidence after a loved one dies. If you're not sure where to start, use the Voice Memos app on an Apple device or Google Audio Journal app for an Android or Google device, or a traditional tape recorder is also a wonderful option if you have access to one." So as we're kind of getting into space for Q&A, I would love to know more about your people, your loved ones. I would love to know more about your losses. If there's a specific date or entry that you would like me to read, I would love to read it for you. Yeah, this little book has been its own kind of exploration, its own kind of journey, and it's yet another stepping stone in all the books I hope to write as somebody who is grieving and also somebody who is a student of grief, perpetually studying grief for the rest of my life.
How did you come to be a grief coach?
Very much by accident. I studied marketing and communications and then minored in psychology and art in college. And I actually lost my mom while I was in college. She was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2012. It went into remission. We were all celebrating. And then it came back very suddenly, and she died the day after Christmas in 2013 while my sister and I were both on winter break from college. And so I finished the degree I was working on. But I mean, speaking of the death of hopes, dreams, and expectations that I wrote about, I had all these big dreams of becoming an advertising executive and getting a C-suite and becoming one of the first women CEOs in the ad industry, which is what I did my whole thesis on, because only 3% of CEOs in the ad industry are women, and yet ads are targeted mostly 80% to women. It's been fascinating work to look into, but all those dreams died. All of a sudden, those things weren't important, and death has this way of just like tightening or narrowing down or making crystal clear all of your priorities and or stripping away everything that was before. And all of a sudden I felt like I was standing stark naked or falling stark naked into this canyon that just never ended. And I was like, what do I do now? What am I supposed to do with my life? What's my purpose? What's my why am I here? What's going on? And so there was this very big restructuring of life as I knew it. And I kept getting this call to study grief as a way to walk myself through it. if that makes sense. And so I started, the library was the very first place that I went, which is my favorite part of my story. I was like, I gotta hear from other people who have done this, because I knew they did. In my head, I knew, mentally, I knew, but in my heart, I was like, I don't know how other people survive this. I don't know how I'm going to survive this. And so I got my very first public library card as an adult. I would bike to the library once or twice a week, and I would just go to the grief section, and I would sit there and I would thumb through titles, and I would take some home, and um, and just experience the stories of other people who'd come back. I was memoir, I was in self-help, I was in poetry, I was in all these things that if you talk about loss, I want to hear what you have to say. And that merged into podcasts, and gradually I started sharing what I was learning in public spaces. Started in private spaces on my personal Facebook, and people said, oh, that's something I never considered before. What book is that from? Or where did you hear that? Or how is it helping you? And enough people said, hey, you should do something with this, that I decided to. So I launched my podcast coming back in 2017. And then people are like, hey, these things are helpful. You should write a book. And so there's been a lot of you shoulds sort of happening throughout. And so I wrote my first book, Permission to Grieve, and self-published it. And that was released in 2019. And then I was approached by Penguin Random House in January of last year to write Your Grief Your Way. And it's just kind of been another stepping stone along the journey. And I've noticed that mostly what people want to hear is not the solution or the way out, which really there's not one, which is both disheartening and also kind of freeing in its own way. If there's no right answer, you can stop trying to find one and simply exist in the experience that is grief. But I noticed that a lot of my strengths and a lot of my gifts come in working directly with other people through workshops, through book events, through one-on-ones, and even through writing. People just need to hear that they're okay within the experience, that they're not wrong for grieving, that it's not their fault that they're grieving, that they're not being too sensitive, which is a huge thing that's coming up these days, especially with COVID. That there's nothing wrong with you for grieving. This is an innate part of the human experience. We collectively, just as a society, especially in westernized society, just don't talk about it. And so that's why it feels like it's a crazy thing that's happening to you, or you have gone crazy, when in reality you are experiencing something that millions and millions of people have experienced since the very beginning of time. So a great part of the work I do is normalizing the fact that grief's happening at all, and then offer these practical suggestions for, okay, now that you recognize it's happening, you can honor it in yourself. Now, what are you going to do with it? If that makes sense.
Yes. Well, I have another question, but we have two dates. The first one is from Madeline, who is curious to hear about May 23rd, when she lost her sister, and also when she got her sister. It was the same birthday and death date for Madeline.
Oh, that gives me chills.
Yeah.
Yes, your entrance to the world and also your exit from it. Same day. That's kind of spooky and also kind of neat. Wow. Yeah, I have not heard that before. So the entry from May 23rd, this was from page 76. If you're keeping score at home and have a copy of the book already, May 23rd reads, create an altar for your grief in your home. Whether or not you're religious, an altar is a beautiful way to give grief and your loved one physical space in your day-to-day life. I've seen all kinds of altars, ranging from the more traditional photo and a candle on the dresser type to an entire room devoted to memorializing a loved one. No matter what form your altar takes, it should remind you of your relationship with and your love for your loved one every time you engage with it. Each time you pass by or enter into the sacred altar space, remind yourself that part of grieving is making room for grief to show up. Allowing grief space in your physical world helps you process it in your mental, emotional, and spiritual worlds as well. And I wrote this because I have an aunt. My mom died in 2013, and one of my aunts, my mom's sister, keeps this. She has like one of those really tall Pottery Barn lanterns that's like clear glass and then the black lead on all sides. And she puts this big tall pillar candle in it. And every single morning when she walks out of her bedroom, she'll just take a lighter, she'll light the candle, and then she'll just go about her day. And the candle burns all day. And I remember I asked her about it once, and she said, oh, this is for your mom. so that I'm awake, she's awake, she's kind of with me as I live my days, and then I burn it out before I go to sleep. And there's not even a picture of my mom there. There's no quotes, there's no crosses, there's no religion, like there's nothing around it to indicate that this is a memorial for someone who died. And also it's a little daily ritual, and it's a little tiny piece of physical space in her living room that says, this is for Sandy, this is for my sister, this is the room that she takes up.
Wonderful. The attendee EF asks if you would please read the entries for June 20th and October 8th. Those are the dates for their best friend and dad. They are also a fellow art minor and library fan.
Oh, hello. Yay. I love meeting other artsy fartsy people on calls. That's one of my favorite things. Best friend and dad, respectively. So we'll start with June 20th. I'm going to go chronologically, if that's okay. And then we'll do October 8th as well. So June 20th is another practical tip. If you're overwhelmed by the thought of grief or struggling to squeeze grief into a packed agenda, consider scheduling time to grieve for 1 hour a week. Psychologists often suggest that anxious patients schedule time to worry so that their worrying is kept to a minimum outside of that scheduled worry time. You might try a similar approach to grief. Having a regular designated grief date can help you get more accomplished during the week and allow you to go deep when you're mentally and emotionally prepared to address grief one-on-one. When you feel grief during the week, make a note of your emotions in your phone or a private notebook. Then, on your scheduled grief date, pull up your notes and work through them one by one. Giving grief a guaranteed space to process each week is a surefire way to keep it from becoming too much to handle. If you're not used to feeling big, hard, or negative emotions, scheduling time to feel them can help you remember that these emotions are not life-threatening and that they are a part of the normal and natural human experience. And I was actually inspired to do this piece by the author Gretchen Rubin, who wrote The Happiness Project, which is strange because why would you take a cue from The Happiness Project to write a book about grief? But I believe in her book Better Than Before, which was a sequel to Happiness Project, she talked about how some people do wonderfully having an hour in their week to worry, as opposed to I'm sitting at work and I'm working on this project or I'm in a meeting and all of a sudden the visual of my mom on her deathbed like pops into my brain. I'm like, whoa, okay, that's a lot. I don't know if I have space for this right now. I'm going to write down visual of my mom on her deathbed, close it in a notebook. We'll get to that on Sunday. And so literally when that arrives, it's like I open up this whole notebook of really hard things and I have a good cry about it, or I yell about it, or put on screamo music about it, or whatever needs to happen. You literally don't have to sit open a notebook and cry for an hour. There are many ways to process grief. But oftentimes I work with clients who say, I just feel like grief is bothering me all the time, like this little sibling that's tapping me on the shoulder, be like, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. And sometimes giving grief a very designated space in your life, in your schedule, just like giving grief a designated space in your home, is like, I see you, I'm honoring you, you're a part of my life, I'm not ignoring you. And also, you are not the only thing that's happening in my life. I still work, or I still have kids, or I still, have to run errands, or I still have to sleep. So even as you're sleeping and all these thoughts are coming to you, it's like, okay, we'll get to that on our grief date. And you can definitely make it more than an hour if need be. I might cushion it on either end with things that feel soft or safe to you. Jumping over to October 8th. Let's see, October 8th reads, just about everyone who grieves has a dream of their loved one at one time or another. These dreams take all forms, from soft, lighthearted visitations to vivid, panic-inducing flashbacks to bizarre, silly happenstances. If you would like to see your loved one more often in your dreams, try writing your dreams down in a journal for 30 days. The moment you wake up, set a timer for 10 minutes and record everything from your dream that you remember. Doing so triggers your brain to recognize that you are paying attention to your dreams, and gradually, your brain will learn to provide you with more focus and recall in the morning. If you can't remember your dream or know that you didn't dream, simply write, I didn't have a dream last night, and wait to have a dream the next time you sleep. You can find out more about grief dreams and listen to the grief dreams of others at griefdreams.ca. And the Grief Dreams podcast is absolutely one of my favorite resources for life after loss, because I had so many dreams about my mom after she died. Some of them were wonderful. I got to hug her and see her, and others I was reliving her death and the day she died over and over and over again. And they are things that haunt people, but they are also things that inspire people or help them move through their grief or things like that. And they're fascinating to study. And the host of this podcast called Grief Dreams actually did his master's thesis or his doctorate thesis. He's a PhD now on grief dreams and studied their frequency and how often people have them and what they have them about, and is literally data coding for the first time dreams of the deceased. It's a phenomenal resource. And if you're looking to remember your dreams, studies show that the best way is to write them down for 30 days and your brain trains itself to remember what it saw or experienced the night before.
Excellent. Well, we also have another date here. Janine says, "Hi, Shelby. I was honored to be part of your beta reader team. I'd love it if you could share what's on May 14th.
Yay! And thank you so much for being in my beta reader team. I love the process of pre-launching books almost as much as I love launching them into the world. Yes, to have people be like, I have something to say about this, and then doing small edits in Accord, and then actually allowing the whole world to see it. So this is actually a quote entry. So of all the requests we received so far, this is the first one that's actually a quote and then some commentary. So May 14th reads, "One often calms one's grief by recounting it." And this is a quote from Pierre Corneille. "You may think that reliving your grief story is only bringing up the past or staying stuck on the negative. In fact, the opposite is true. Research shows that retelling what happened can help us make meaning of our loved one's death, cope with the hole that loss has left, and locate others who understand what grief is like." And I love this because there's such a stigma about after it's been, depending on your loss, a month or 6 months or a year, it's time to put your grief away and nobody talks about it anymore. And if you bring it up, you're bringing up the negative or bringing up the past or bringing up sad, like you are wrong for bringing up your grief. And I'm like, oh my God, these are losses. These are people, these are circumstances, these are life-changing events that we carry with us for the rest of our lives. So it doesn't make sense that there would be a stopping point to talking about them because they continue to influence us literally daily. And so retelling your story, granted, in safe spaces with people who, I hesitate to say consent to hear it, but who want to hear it and can hold that space for you, or in even public spaces like social media, can help you locate other people that are also telling their grief stories. It can help you process what happened or find more meaning, especially as you live more life. And it can help you kind of get it out of your own head. Sometimes the best way to process grief is just to get it out of the container that is your body. Yeah. And it's one of the best ways, I'll insert a tip in here that may or may not be in the book. Oh, it is in the book. I just don't remember what day it's on. Sometimes we don't know if our friends and family are safe places for our grief. And so to offer a disclaimer before we say something is a really phenomenal way to kind of test the water. Like, is this a safe place to share my grief? So something like my dad's been on my mind a lot lately. I wonder, is it okay if I share a story about him with you, or something I've been thinking about a lot lately? And this honors that we have our own things that we want to share, but our friends and family, they are also out living their own lives and probably, especially again in this era of COVID-19, living with their own griefs. So they are having their own daily struggles and rituals that they don't get to do anymore. And often kids tasks other family members, even caregiving for people that they have to manage. And so honoring our emotional need, but also honoring their time to be able to listen and to be able to take in our stories is really valuable too. It shows that you respect their time as a friend, but also that you have a desire to be heard.
Well, excuse me. It's not quite the elephant in the room. Maybe it can be the pig in the room. We have one of your beta readers with us, and you mentioned that Penguin Random House reached out to you in January of last year to write the book, which is shortly before all of this COVID situation happened. So I was curious what it was like to write a book, and how that influenced you to say, I love pre-launching almost as much as launching.
Yeah. So this was very surreal. So I got the offer to write the book from Penguin in January of this past year. And then 2 months later, everything shut down here in the United States. I lost 2 of my side jobs. I was only writing this book. And at a time when I thought I would only be kind of drawing up on the death of my mother and then writing a grief book from that, all of a sudden I was also drawing on the fresh grief of everyone, the entire world, processing COVID-19 at the same time. And so there was the loss of the abstract, hopes, dreams, expectations, rituals, things of that nature. But then there was also the loss of the very concrete, the loss of people, the loss of relationships, the loss of homes, the loss of money. And so there was all of these other griefs kind of tangled up with it, and then all these other abstract griefs together. And so those got married. And then there was the grief of my mother kind of living underneath it as a reference point for me. And then I was also experiencing these griefs myself. So it wasn't like I was sitting in some lifeguard chair watching the whole world have grief over COVID. I was like, I'm in the pool. We're all in the pool together. And then I'm writing a book about it. So there were days when I wrote a ton and days when I just crashed out. I was like, nope, cannot approach a book about grief because I am grieving so heavily and so hard. It was an absolutely just wild experience to write, because sometimes I would be grieving as I was writing this book. And I was like, am I grieving for myself in COVID, or am I grieving for the girl that lost her mother? And I couldn't tell. And there were pieces that felt very similar. So when I lost my mother, I lost my idea of home. I lost my faith in God growing up, and have since totally transformed that relationship. But also I lost my sense of safety and being protected in the world, believing that the world is a good and safe place. And those griefs were coming up again loudly in COVID, especially with people like, are we wearing masks or are we not? And then there were political debates about everything. And what about how our hospitals are being kept? And what about, are we going back to work? Or are we not going back to work? There's so many questions. And then this just universal experience of what is grief, if not uncertainty that keeps going into the future. And I felt there was kind of a humorous and bitter sentiment from a lot of the clients and people that I worked with of, yeah, now the rest of the world knows what it's like to grieve, finally. Like they'll understand us when we say it doesn't go away, or they'll understand us when we say we're still not sure what the answer is, or living in this massive uncertainty. But then also to have finished something in COVID, to be working on something, to complete something, and then to have it ready to share with the world in some way. I don't think that COVID could have eliminated that joy or that pride. I think I've been a creative person ever since I was like 2, 3, 4, 5, like small. And it's been different things. It's been watercoloring, it's been piano, it's been vocal training, it's been singing, it's been musical theater, it's been more recently podcasting, and even more recently writing. Like they've kind of just, scattered around into the category of Renaissance woman. It's like all the things except for 3D sculpture. I can't wrap my head around that just yet. But there's still a pride in that, and a joy in having created something, especially knowing, like, not only did I write a book about grief, I wrote a book about grief at a time when the whole world was grieving. So it's not only I'm really proud that this exists, I'm proud that this exists right now. And so there was this, not only is there a joy in releasing it, but there's also a need on the receiving end. And I think that's always true for grief books. I'm glad that more and more grief books keep being released into the world. Every time somebody emails me to read or offer cover quotes for one of their grief books, I'm thrilled. I'm like, yes, another one. We're joining the club. Because historically in the publishing industry, grief books are not very well received or published or marketed to the world. So I even appreciate that something like this container with Books in Common is happening with grief. But yes, there is still some kind of joy and pride in inviting other people into the experience. What do you think? Share your thoughts with me. Be a pre-reader. Leave reviews. I want to know as an author how this is landing with you, and that informs how I write in the future, and even informs how I talk about the book in public spaces. And then even sharing it. It's like, yeah. And that kind of points this arrow too, is that like grief has a lot of power and COVID has a lot of power. And also there are some things, at least for me, I can't project onto other people's grief stories, that could not be wholly taken away, or that I could wholly be robbed of. So the joy and pride that comes from having made something with my own 2 hands on a keyboard, for lack of better phrasing. Yeah.
I started like 9 knitting projects and didn't finish any of them. So
and I think that's kind
more
of the
power to you.
And I'm not saying that like I'm a better person for having accomplished something in COVID. It was literally, I was under deadline and contract, so I kind of had to. I don't believe there would have been an extension granted in my favor. And there were dark nights during this where I was like, I don't know if I'm going to finish this thing. So I did what my analytical spreadsheet brain likes to do and literally made spreadsheets. I found, let's see, there's 366 entries in here. So that's 183, 4 quotes, and then 183, 4, I don't remember what the number is, practical exercises. And so I did that thing like you have exercises in school where it's like they put a bunch of state names and then a bunch of state capitals on one side, but they're all mixed up and you have to draw the line to like match them up with each other, but 180 something times. And so I had a quote from somebody that sounded like this, that was about grief feels like, Lemony Snicket has a wonderful quote that's like, grief feels like climbing upstairs but the last step is missing. And so you stumble at the last step because you think there's one more step than there is. And then the alternating practice was about envisioning falling in a great abyss and then creating something to catch you. And so it's like who can be sistered together. And that's literally how the whole book got knitted together. But wow, was that an experience and continues to be so.
Yes, I imagine. I'm curious, excuse me. I mean, you've mentioned sort of that the idea of the grief cycle, and by laying it out based on dates, I'm curious how you would apply utilizing the book for some when you're not like right up against like the thing didn't happen yesterday. Today you're going to open Your Grief Your Way. Like, you know, your mom passed in 2013. Like, how would you approach, like, what day do you pick?
Yeah. Well, I tell people, I'm like, please feel free to play roulette with it. It's very much a book. Like, this is not a linear process for getting through grief. You don't have to start in January and end in December to get something out of it, which I think is a misconception of devotionals, is like you start on day one, kind of like a diet plan or something. And then like by the end of it, you'll have lost this thing that you don't want, or you'll have gained this thing that you do want. Nope, not the case with Your Grief Your Way. You can literally dive in anywhere and it should offer you something that's helpful or comforting. And if not, flip to another page. I love that about it, because one of the first things I used after my mom died, because this didn't exist yet, was one of those page a day calendars that like sits by your bed and you like rip off a new one every day. And it just had a quote on it. But for some reason, having somebody else say something about life that helped them helped me. And they weren't in any sort of order. I didn't go from point A to point B. The goal wasn't to accomplish anything. It was just to perhaps widen the perspective with which I was seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. And that's kind of the goal here. It's like, how can I feel more comforted in the aftermath of loss, or how can I set up structures and systems that help? But then also with the days that are quotes, the ones that are always at the top of the page, it's just like, how can I potentially see grief a way that I'm not seeing it right now? And that kind of expansion is also its own kind of growth, even if you're not actually doing anything. Something's happening in here, even if something's not happening out here, if that makes sense.
Sure. Excellent. Well, Catherine is curious. What do you suggest for me when I find that those times I think about my beloveds who have died, instead of feeling happy with the many memories of the great times, I seem to immediately dive into feeling deeply sad and into my grief?
First off, that's very normal. I don't know how far out you are from your losses, and it doesn't necessarily matter how far out. I think time is a minimal factor in determining grief and life after loss. So don't let anybody tell you it's been long enough and you gotta get over it. So I think that's really common, especially if you're really close to your loss, is kind of the disclaimer I'll give, is that all that comes up is dark, is sad, is deathbed, is tragedy, is accident, is finding out the news, is being alone in my bed, is, I mean, kind of these really hard and dark, like I get this imagery of like somebody taking your spine and just twisting it, and all your guts kind of get twisted up and everything just feels awful and sad and bad. And it feels like trying to put happy memories over that, or trying to remember, but there was also this time we went to the park, or we rode the carousel, or I watched them graduate, or whatever it was. It's trying to put sprinkles on top of a huge pile of elephant poop. Like it's trying to pretty up or to balance out an experience that cannot be balanced out yet. So I think My initial suggestion for you, Catherine, is to let it be true that everything that's coming up is deeply sad, is grief, is pain, and also this is not how it will be forever. And if you'll give me one quick second, I'm actually going to dive into an entry that I think I remember. Let's see. Well, I can't find the entry. Apparently, I use this verbiage a lot through the book. Anyway, there's an entry somewhere in here, Grief Your Way, because this is a tool I use with all of my clients. Surrounding the word right now, because one of the most common misconceptions that grieving people believe, including myself after the death of my mother, is because the loss was so permanent. Death is so permanent, divorce is so permanent, diagnosis is so permanent, whatever grief event you experience is so permanent that the way I feel right now, how my life looks right now, is how it's always going to be. This is also permanent. And so, Catherine, I wonder if the story you're telling yourself right now is, I immediately dive into feeling deeply sad and into my grief, and this is how it's always going to be. I will never be able to remember them with happiness or fondness. I will never see or even want the sprinkles, and or the big pile of elephant poop will always be a big pile of elephant poop, for lack of better metaphor and phrasing in this moment. And something that I do with my clients, especially if they're buying into this permanence idea, which is something I bought into as well, which is something I think all grieving people buy into, is to use the words right now to frame your experience. It's a teeny tiny little prepositional phrase, but you could say something along the lines of, every time I think about my beloveds who've died, instead of feeling happy, right now, all I'm feeling is sadness and grief. And that opens up the door just like this much to be like, this could possibly change in the future. And you could use different prepositional phrases I've used: in this moment, for the time being, in this season, for the last year, like whatever prepositional phrase like frames the temporariness of what you're experiencing. And also, this is happening right now, but something could also happen differently in the future. I will say, if you want like a more practical approach to this, if you want happy memories to be dominant, there's another exercise I did in your grief year. I'm going to try and look it up. Again, we'll see if I actually land on the entry I want to land on. Yes, okay, this is from February 11th, so I'm actually going to read you a bit from this, because I also struggle to remember happy memories of my mom. When I think of my mother, right now, about 7, almost 8 years later, I am just starting to get joy first. And then right on the tail end, right behind it, is pain. And I don't know that there will ever be a day when one comes without the other. I think they are permanently tied with regard to her. There's another thing I use with clients called the 99% rule of grief. For as happy as you feel, for as happy as you are, on a wedding day, on a graduation, even just like an ordinary day where the weather's beautiful and you're outside walking and everything just seems to be falling into place, there is always 1% of your head, always 1% of your heart that remembers everything and everyone you've ever lost. There's always 1% of you that is grieving. And that's okay. Sometimes it's bigger than 1%. Sometimes it feels like 10, 20, 30, 40, 80% grief and like 20% joy. But it makes sense. Like that's how grief operates, is it companions you for the rest of your life, and it doesn't need to be erased or like blasted into oblivion. It's not wrong. It's not wrong for existing. Yeah, but there's like that 1% rule of like, this will always come with, and that's okay. That's okay. So February 11th says, use your imagination or an online word generator to make a list of 52 random words. Here are 5 to get you started: breakfast, flower, school, table, music. Once a week, choose a word from your list of random words and call forth a memory of your loved one based on that word. For example, the word breakfast reminds me of my mom making cinnamon toast and joking about how toast is a Midwest staple, whereas my father's breakfast of choice, biscuits, is an essential breakfast item in the American South. I can still see my mom mixing cinnamon and sugar together in a Tupperware container to always have on hand in the pantry. This exercise helps you keep your memories of your loved one front and center as you continue to live your life into the future. So, this is similar to the brain recalling dreams exercise, where if you genuinely want to experience more happy memories than sad, or kind of just want to add more on to your collection that seems to be growing, it's like you're curating a museum of your loved one with memories in your brain. You can ask your brain to do the work of recalling happy or even neutral memories about your person. I don't know that my mom making cinnamon toast is necessarily a happy memory, but it's definitely a neutral memory and one I still have of her. But I don't know that I would have recalled it had somebody not said the word breakfast. And so, like, having this list of random words, you could do 365 if you want to. You could do a brand new one every day and just overload your brain with here's neutral or happy memories to kind of offset or balance out all I reckon with is pain on a regular basis. It gives you a much bigger bank to draw from when all that you're working with is deep sadness and heavy grief.
Wonderful. Well, just a friendly reminder that if you have a question for Shelby, you can leave it in the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen or drop it in the chat there. I'm watching both, so don't be shy, or don't feel like you have to be shy. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that a lot of people have come to the book not necessarily grieving death, but grieving other losses in their life. And one of the strange things I have felt unprepared for in adulthood is the sort of natural loss of friendships and just like the growing apart of friendships. And so I'm curious what little tidbits from the book you might have about learning to process and letting go of some of those things that just, that's their natural, it's their natural lifespan.
Yeah, well, and I will say the book is specifically geared towards people who have lost a loved one to death, but you can kind of use the exercises for other types of losses and even use the quotes for other types of losses. Loss of friendships is one of the most common and least recognized types of griefs. And this is actually the topic of a forthcoming book of mine, not the one I'm working on right now, but a forthcoming book of mine, because especially in the aftermath of a loss, so I lost my mother, I had so many friends who disappeared or showed up with really shitty advice. Like, just have a drink. I was in college at the time. Like, just have a drink, just come to the party. I was like, this will not make me forget my mother who died. And just reckoning with people who didn't know what to do with my grief and suddenly becoming the teacher to other people about my grief experience when they, in theory, should be approaching me saying, how can I help? Or I want to be of assistance to you, or just sitting and listening, which is really all I wanted, was fascinating and very, very painful at the same time. And also, you're right, there are instances in life where the big grief event is just the loss of a friendship. You don't even have to have another grief event that precedes it. And the passages that are coming to mind for me right now, I don't know if I'll be able to find the one I want to read, are all about forgiveness, and not forgiveness for your friends. Not forgiveness for your friends, not right away, but forgiveness for yourself. Because oftentimes we do everything we can do to salvage a friendship. We make all the communications we can make. We change ourselves or our habits into different ways that become more, I call it pursuing and shape shifting. I literally talked about this with a client today. It's like we are in pursuit of a solution for this issue with a friend, and then we will shape shift our way so that we do not lose the friendship, because we don't want to go through that loss. We don't want to experience that. And we have to forgive ourselves for doing everything we could possibly do to keep that friendship alive. I did the best I could do. I exhausted all of my resources. If something new comes along, I am willing to try it. And then also, oftentimes, just like death of a loved one with friends, we have to we have to release resentments that we have towards them, or we have to express them in some way. We don't necessarily have to release them just yet. We have to say, I'm sorry for the ways that we effed up in our friendships. We have to release things or ways that they did us wrong and maybe didn't know it, or maybe did, and we still harbor grudges or resentments toward them. And then also sometimes with friendships that disappear or turn sour or just evolve into something different, even if we can't say it to the friend directly, we can't write a letter, we can't make a phone call, or it's not safe to do so, we're afraid of backlash or something else happening within a friend group. Even if you just write it down for yourself, saying thank you. Thank you for companioning me for 4 years of my life, for 20 years of my life, since I was 5. Like, thank you for being here to witness so much of my life. And I think forgiveness, grief over the loss of friends is so hard because society just doesn't see it, ought to recognize it. When oftentimes, and especially for those in marginalized communities, so I'm thinking communities of color, queer communities, even disabled communities, friends are your family. They are where the acceptance comes from. They are where the community comes from. They are where the truth about you comes from. And so to grieve them is absolutely devastating. And also, just like loss of a loved one to death or other losses, to allow it to take a while, to allow it to stick with you and come with you. So it's like, oh, I lost a friend and then that's over and I grieve that and we're done. And now time to wait for the real griefs or the big griefs or blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, I still have friendships I grieve from high school. And I wonder what would have happened if, and I resent the way that we communicated with each other at the end. And I'm also so grateful that that friend group was present for me. So it's like all of these things are all true at the same time. Grief is a great practice in holding multiple things to be true at the same time. Let's see. If it's okay, I'm going to read a passage from May 7th all about self-forgiveness and see if this resonates with anybody tonight for loss of friendships, but also for any other grief you may experience. So May 7th says, many of my clients have an easier time forgiving others than forgiving themselves. If you're struggling to forgive yourself for something, whether it was something you did or said or something you'd wish you'd done or said, try this. Sit in a quiet place. Put your hand over your heart and say, I forgive you for, insert action here. Then inhale and exhale 3 times, holding space in your mind for your humanness and self-love. If this practice is too out there for you, face yourself in a mirror and offer yourself forgiveness as if you were offering it to another person, or find a photo of yourself as a child or as a baby to forgive. Know that forgiveness is usually not a one-time event. It's a practice that's carried out over and over again. You may have to forgive yourself 12 or 20 or 200 times for something you didn't say or do. That's okay. Just take a deep breath and say, I forgive you for, insert action here. Then inhale and exhale 3 times. Yeah. And there's also instances too, I think, with loss of friendships where the friendship will die or burn out in the middle of a conversation. And so it helps to find a place or a way to express what you would have liked to have said somewhere, whether it's writing it down, whether it's calling in another trusted friend, whether it's going to counseling or therapy, whether it's working with a grief coach, like, yeah, somewhere to say, we didn't get to finish this. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Ariana asks, what is one piece of essential advice or one tool or strategy you have for adults helping children and teens as they grieve? Are there suggested ways to use your books for this?
No. So to answer your last question directly, no, this is not a book intended for kids' grief, although there are activities in here that you can do with your kids if you have kids or teens, such as making a paper chain and stringing it around your house to honor either days counting down to a 1-year death anniversary or grief anniversary or a loved one's birthday that you're celebrating without them here, or starting on the day they died and honoring all the days that you have survived without them, because it takes effort and it is exhausting to remain alive after somebody that you love dies. And so it can be a visual way to be like, look, I'm surviving. And kids think that's really neat to be able to either put the chain together or as you're counting down to something to rip it apart. And that can be really cathartic too. And then one of my favorite books for helping kids grieve, I have a few. Or resources. The first one is Option B by Cheryl Sandberg, where she tells the story of losing her husband suddenly on vacation and then returning home to her kids. She talks about taking either a whiteboard or a sheet of paper and making a new list of house rules after somebody in the family, or somebody adjacent to the family dies. And it's like, crying is acceptable at any time. You are not required to join the family for dinner. Like you get to make your own rules based on the fact that grief is now present in your family. Or it's like, you don't have to make your beds. Like the chores that were required of you, these things that were kind of extras on your life, are no longer required. Or like every Friday night we'll watch a movie together and that will be family bonding time. Or yeah, something of that nature. Oh, thank you to the person who posted option B in the comments. Wonderful. And then also the second resource I'll recommend is the give me a moment. It was formerly known as the Dear Dougie podcast. Grief Out Loud is the name of the podcast. Thank you for holding. Thank you for holding. It's called Grief Out Loud, and it's hosted by Janet DeCristofaro, who is a therapist at the Dougie Center for Grieving Children in Portland, Oregon, and it is the biggest center for grieving children and teens in the United States. And their resources, their podcast, every single episode of their show addresses grieving kids. And my personal piece of advice for you, Ariana, about helping children and teens grieve is to leave the conversation open. Do not ever think that you have had the last conversation you're ever going to have with your teens or your kids about their grief. As they get to different stages in their life developmentally, as they hit different milestones, I'm leaving 5th grade and going to middle school, I have to get braces, I'm going through puberty, I'm having sex for the first time, whatever it may be, new griefs will come up for them. Or they will wonder what their person that they lost was like at that age, or they'll have questions about, especially as kids get less with the concrete and they need to see things for them to be true and more into the abstract, which usually happens in teenage years, especially going late middle school to high school, is like I can think abstractly about what death is and what meaning is and what purpose is. They will ask you different questions about grief and loss. Also, never assume that kids want to go to a funeral or kids don't want to go to a funeral. Ask them if they'd like to go. Offer them the opportunity to opt into that experience or opt out. Because I've heard from so many of my clients and even so many of my podcast guests who said, I wish I could have gone to the funeral, but my parents thought I was too young, couldn't handle it. So I was never allowed to go. And so there was always something that was never finished for me. Or I was told that I was going. I didn't get the chance to opt out. And now I have a fear of funerals and death. So it's like kids can be offered a bit more freedom and autonomy than we think they can. And yes, on our end, that might mean coordinating childcare either at the funeral or at home while we go to the funeral. But don't assume that you know how kids grieve or how they want to grieve. Let them tell you and offer it to them in questions that are age appropriate. And Dear Dougie has some, the Dougie Center for Grieving Children have some tremendous like one-sheeters, podcast episodes, resource books, workshops that are free or low cost that are phenomenal to attend. And whenever COVID is less in the world, I don't ever want to say that COVID is over because I don't know what that looks like or even if that's a possibility. And I think we'll always grieve about it. But whenever you can attend in-person events that they host, they are absolutely tremendous, especially their summer camps. Yes, looks like in the comments too, we're getting suggestions of Farewell to Sadness is a really amazing book to help kids grieve. And I have not heard of that one, so I'm going to add that one to my list as well. And thank you again for sharing option B.
Madeline is curious. Well, first, I love the thank you to friends idea for accompanying. I am wondering about your thoughts on why it seems difficult for society to acknowledge COVID-related losses at this time, as we have so many new grievers among us now. Politicization, fear, other ideas. My question is related to COVID-related deaths specifically.
Yeah. Modern Loss, the organization Modern Loss, I would love if somebody could find this article. I believe it was published in Yahoo News, did a tremendous piece on how we will be experiencing not necessarily a backlash, but like a grief hangover about 5 to 10 years from now when we really, really realize everything that COVID has taken from us. Modern Loss, Rebecca Sofer and Gabrielle Berkner wrote the piece, I believe it was for Yahoo News, about we will have a hangover from this. We will, and hangover is not the best term to use because it's not related to alcohol or alcoholism. But like we're not grieving in its entirety right now. Part of it is that we can't. So Madeline, I think this is a wonderful question because we cannot fully recognize, experience, grieve, release, honor the trauma of a traumatic experience while we are still living inside of it. Bessel van der Kolk in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, does a tremendous job of writing about this, especially in terms of traumatized children. It's like you wouldn't ask a child who is living at home still being abused by parents to start processing their trauma when they're still afraid to go to sleep every night for fear of a parent hurting them. It's impossible. It's a different area of your brain that experiences the trauma, and then another area of your brain that processes it. And yes, they're connected and they're important, they're in conversation with each other, but we will not know the full extent of this and the ways in which we've grieved until we're a little farther away from it, I think. And also, we will not have the energy reserves to fully grieve until we are farther away from it. We are all in survival mode of some flavor right now. So we're not all in the same kind of survival mode, but we're all in survival mode. I read this wonderful quote the other day that said, F anyone who says we're all in the same boat, because we're not all in the same boat. We are all in different boats navigating the same storm. So some people are in yachts in this storm. Some people are in cruise liners. Some people are in canoes with holes in the bottom. And this is based on our resources, our race, our class, our economics, whether or not we have a job right now, whether or not we're child caring at home, whether or not we have relatives or loved ones who have died or not, whether or not we are sick ourselves. There's so many factors affecting like how we are experiencing this trauma, but we are all experiencing a collective kind of trauma together. So that's part of it. I also resonate with the question that it could be politicization. Did I say that word correctly? Politics informing the grief.
I don't think I did. So
I also resonate with this idea that politics are a part of the grief, because to acknowledge the full extent of the grief that we're facing means that we need to overhaul how we treat grief in this country. I'm speaking United States specifically. So if you're tuning in from somewhere else, I don't know as much about where you live, but we would need to overhaul healthcare, specifically mental health and therapy resources, and make them free for all, truly free for all. We need to address the failings in our healthcare system that led to this. We need to address the failings in our politicians that also led to this. Grief is political, and you can't tell me otherwise. We cause grief and we prevent grief through the laws that are passed, through the people that we elect, through the measures that we vote on. And yes, there is a political influence to why we are not grieving so deeply right now. That being said, I believe the Daily New York Times podcast did a wonderful episode on Joe Biden coming into office and how his griefs of losing a son and his first wife and another child, I believe, have uniquely prepared him to be, quote unquote, a grief president. I am not 1,000% for Biden. There's a lot about his work that I disagree with. And also, I hope, I don't believe yet, I haven't seen it, but I hope that we are on our way to something that looks like better grief care and death care in this country. And right now, we are still restricting grief care and death care to death, as opposed to all of the ways that we are impacted. I'm thinking bankruptcy and financial loss specifically as it relates to COVID, and job loss as well. What was the other thing that you mentioned in that question? I'm scrolling back up in the chat. Fear. Absolutely. We're a country that doesn't know what to do with grief. If you follow the Enneagram at all, the United States is a 3 country, which means that we are uniquely positioned to focus on success, achievement, the pursuit of happiness. That's our slant. And right now we are being faced with the exact opposite of that. We are being faced with uncertainty. We are being faced with not knowing what to do. We are being faced with kind of sadness, which is the opposite of the pursuit of happiness, but also anger, rage, numbness, turmoil, and for lack of better phrasing, a real disintegration of faith in and trust in both others and ourselves as people. And we have not collectively reckoned with this, perhaps ever, because I'm thinking back to other collective trauma events for the United States. Specifically, I'm thinking of 9/11, I'm thinking of World War II, I'm thinking of World War I, all these other events. It seemed as if, or at least history books told us, history books written by mostly white people, told us that these events, the country was unified in its messaging. It was unified in its purpose. It was unified in what we were doing with it. So now we are facing a situation where not only are we being collectively traumatized by something that is not another country that we can go attack, we can't attack coronavirus and make it go away or diminish it into smallness or wreckage, but also we are deeply divided on what the hell we should do about it. And so not only is there pain, grief, trauma, there is also conflict, uncertainty, misinformation, and judgment. So we are creating a very toxic environment for processing grief. How do you feel safe processing grief? Not only when you don't have the energy and stamina, which you don't have right now, when you're not far enough away from it, but also when you are deeply judged for expressing this kind of pain at all. And I say this and like, this brings up tears in my eyes and everything else, because it just, the lack of kindness we are showing ourselves and each other, we are starving for kindness right now. And we don't know where to find it because it seems as if it's nowhere to be found. And it makes sense. It makes sense that we're not grieving and not grieving well right now. That being said, there are spaces, there are pockets of the world that are making so much room for grief right now. There's the work I do, which is shelbyforsythia.com. There's modern loss. There's the dinner party. If you've experienced loss in your 20s and 30s, you can get matched to a virtual table. It's essentially a potluck where they talk about death and people have lost. There's death cafes almost everywhere in the world. And if you don't know where you want to join, or you're not ready to be in a group with other people, but you just want somebody to listen, there is a remarkable death doula whose work is called A Sacred Passing. And they have founded what's called a listening line, where trained volunteers literally listen to whatever you want to talk about for as long as you want to talk about it. It's not a mental crisis line, it's not a suicide hotline, and it's not a crisis text line. It is simply a space to be like, I have something that needs to be out in the world. It needs to be beyond my body. So taking grief from the container that is this and putting it out beyond yourself, just getting it out of yourself. And they will just listen and validate the pain, the uncertainty, the anxiety, the numbness, whatever it is that you're experiencing. And it's just a phenomenal resource. And there's so many more. It looks like in the chat, also want to give a shout out to the COVID Grief Network, which I've just become involved yet with. So yes, so there are starting to be specific COVID grief resources that are popping up as well. And not just like grief, but like umbrella specific COVID grief that you can look into. And of course, Google is your very best friend. We're getting there. And also, for as much as support for life is discombobulated right now, support for death is discombobulated too. So we're all kind of trying to figure out what to do with this as grief care and death care workers as well, how to best serve the kind of grief that's coming up right now. And the best thing that I can say, at least in the work that I do, is offering space to talk, to be heard, to be a grieving person, because so much of the world does not want to let us be grieving people right now, and we are.
And I love the way that some folks are connecting in the chat and finding some community within some of those spaces. So yay.
Yes.
We are rapidly approaching the end of our time together. So if anyone has any last minute questions or curiosities about other dates in the book, now's your time.
I'm seeing one more in the chat. It's buried in a comment, a longer comment, but it says, how can people who have not experienced family members dying from COVID support people whose family members or loved ones have died? Read this book, please. Just read this book. And this is not a sell. It's a sell, but it's not a sell. Read this book to get familiar with what the experience of grief is like. Also, another book I'll recommend. Let's see if I have it in my magic shelf. Oh, yes. This is a book by Emily McDowell, the creator of Empathy Cards, and Kelsey Crow, who's a PhD. There is no good card for this. What to say and do when life is scary, awful, and unfair to people you love. This is one of my all-time favorite books. It's also illustrated as like a graphic novel on the inside. It's very easy to read and has a million suggestions for how to support people who are grieving when you are not grieving so deeply, grieving the same loss. Granted, a lot of these suggestions are about things to do in person, such as bringing a casserole. So you'll have to get a little creative about but you can also send cards with photos in them. You can write poetry. You can sign up to send them money for groceries one week. Like there's a lot of different ways to shift it or renegotiate it for COVID. You can offer to teach them how to use Zoom if they don't know how to use Zoom for the funeral or memorial. If that seems like a roadblock for them and you're good at tech support, you can step in and be that person as well. You can hire a dog walking service for them. There's a lot of things you can do to support people who are grieving. And if you are grieving somebody and you're finding that your friends and family do not understand, I encourage you to find one of these COVID grief support circles of people who know exactly what you're going through, as opposed to using your energy to try and explain to your friends and family the depth of your grief. You can hope that they'll come around. You can hope that they'll want to sit with you and want to be taught by you what your experience of grief is like, but your energy is very precious right now. You are not required to be a teacher of your grief as you are intimately experiencing loss. Yeah. Yes.
The second book was There Is No Good Card for This. And I was able to drop a link to that for Bookshop. Those artists do have some really amazing empathy cards.
They're hilarious.
They've got I think they've got a thank you card set as well that are really delightful. I know we have them at Country Bookshelf. So check those out for sure. Since you did give us a sneak peek into the secret bookshelf behind you.
Yes.
I'm going to send us out on what are you reading right now?
I'm reading 2 books that are nonfiction. Nonfiction is my favorite genre. If somebody can recommend a novel that has a grief experience in it, I would love to hear about it. But like, man, I struggle to find fiction that I really fall in love with. So if you'd like to populate the chat with those, I'd love to hear about them. So right now I'm reading Mari Andrews' second book called My Inner Sky, which is a processing of her hospitalization, her father's death, kind of how the sky changes different colors. There's the golden hour, there's night, there's dawn, and then there's midday, I believe is how she's broken it up. But unlike her first book, which is very kind of comic-ish, graphic novel-y, very illustrated, this one is very essay format with the occasional drawing dropped in. And as a fellow Enneagram 4, I love her writing. I love where her heart goes. I love where her mind goes. And without going into too much detail, after experiencing my own recent hospitalization in the middle of COVID and then recovery, I'm resonating so hard, not only with her father's loss, the loss of a parent, so the loss of my mother, but also with being hospitalized unexpectedly and then recovering from that as well. And just, God, the way she writes is gorgeous. And then the illustrations are just, it's like the icing on top of this beautiful cake that she's already offered to you. The other book that I'm reading right now is called Do Better by Rachel Ricketts. It's a guide to spiritual activism for white supremacy. And this is because there is a ton of white supremacy in the grief space, especially when self-help authors, workshop leaders, grief teachers, et cetera, have the audacity, the caucasity to tell other people how to grieve. There's something to be said. I'm probably not the best person to speak or write on this, but there's something to be said about the colonization of a grief experience, to think that there is a way to conquer it, to fix it, to triumph over it, to get out of it, to become more powerful than grief, when in reality, grief is a very soft and cyclical and recurring and human experience, and to subject it to that kind of power struggle has white supremacist feelings written all over it. So I'm reading this book to decolonize my grief work, but to also find new and better ways to uplift Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are already doing grief work in this space that is honoring of all the ways that people grieve. Yeah. And it's not a book specifically about grief, but there is grief involved. She says in the introduction, she's like, we're going to get angry and we're going to grieve together. It's a book written for white women by a Black woman who's like, you can do better.
Yes, it's a very good book. Some of the other ones that have been suggested from the chat, let's see, The Roundhouse from Louise Erdrich, The Paris Library, A Job You Mostly Won't Know How to Do.
I like that title. Feels like all of my jobs.
That's from Pete Fromm, and it's a really beautiful look at, I believe the mother dies shortly after giving birth.
Oh,
And so there's the job you mostly don't know how to do is parenting. But there's this
that's an
overlay.
understatement. Wow. Yes.
It's a really beautiful book. I also really love The Roundhouse from Louise Erdrich.
Heard good things.
I was trying to think of what I have in the bookshelf behind me to
And I
recommend
mean, you
for
have
novels.
you have
But
everything I'm seeing, like Little Women all the way to Falling Up by Shel Silverstein.
yeah,
I'm like, it's you have a wide expanse of wonderful things to recommend. I love it.
most of what's behind me, this is my YA shelves.
Yes.
So most of it's young adult. So I was trying to think what jumped to mind.
When I love asking book people what to read next, because they know. You ask apps or you ask like websites, like what do I read next.com. And I'm like, this is trash. I need to ask other people who read. This is why I love, and I mean, let's bring it back to you, but like independent bookstores and libraries so much, because I can literally walk up to someone and say, I loved reading There Is No Good Card for This. A friend I love is grieving. What do I read next? And they'll literally go, boom, here you go. It's lovely. It's like asking a bartender, hey, I like this kind of alcohol and this kind of herb. Can you put them together and make something magical? It's like bespoke book recommendations. It's phenomenal.
Yes.
I love indie bookstores for this because I do that at Barnes and Noble and they look at me like I have, alien, what do you call it? Antenna popping out of my head. I'm like, no, but really, I want to read another book, a concept.
Well, and if you're concerned about how to stay safe in the time of COVID, you can always reach out to us, booksellers, through our store social media channels and through our websites. The links I've been dropping into the chat right now are from bookshop.org, which is a way to support independent bookstores. You can pick a particular independent bookstore to support with Bookshop, or you can just support them in general with Bookshop. So it's a really fun way. And there are a lot of curated lists that you can find on Bookshop. I know countrybookshelf.com has a lot of staff recommendations and things like that. And that's one of our favorite things to do, is get to, what have I read recently that fits this criteria? So talking to people about books is one of our favorite things ever. It's why we're booksellers. So Shelby, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all of the participants that have joined us this evening and for sharing your stories and being open and vulnerable with all of us here tonight. That's just been such a privilege and such a treat. And thank you, Shelby, for joining us. And I'm looking forward to these next two books you have teased us with. If you haven't purchased your copy of Your Grief Your Way, do be sure to visit booksincommonnw.com and just click on the logo of your favorite sponsoring store, or visit Bookshop and support your local bookstore. We do have some other events coming up this week and in May, so be sure to follow us on Eventbrite to see what's coming up next on the calendar. And thank you all so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.